Here. Okay.
Oh my goodness. Well, Justin, I'm glad you got out of the pool long enough to join us.
Yeah, hang on. I'm gonna
crawled out of the Hudson River to join you guys.
That is a very different pool we've not visited yet.
No, but it's on the list. It's on the list.
We can check it off now. Justin's already been in it.
Oh, good. Thank you.
How's everybody doing? Okay.
We are thrilled to have you here today. Welcome to the Psychic Pool Party.
Good to be here.
This is the mess we do every Saturday at 11 a.m.
Great.
Joey, do you want to jump in and give us our usual intro?
I do. Hold on. I've lost my usual intro. This is the highly polished portion of the show.
Yeah, it doesn't get better than this.
It goes downhill from here.
Yeah,
Hello. Oh, there we go. Oh yes. Now I can say who I am because now I can read it. Hi, I'm Joey Stocks. I'm here at the pool with my co-hosts, Graciela Asher, who is a Reiki master and ceremonialist, among many, many other things, and Heather Carlucci, who's a psychic medium and medical intuitive, among many other things. And I'm an editor and grumpy today. That's my description. In this fantasy pool party, no one gets sunburned or sucks chlorine up their nose. The kids are fine, so we're going to spend this perfect poolside hour getting to know our special guest a bit better. Before we dive into that, though, I do want to do a general hello and how are you by leading with the fact that today is hard for me. I don't know how you all are, how this is all sitting on you, but this whole week has been very hard for me. And I didn't think that it was going to get that much harder. And I have a feeling that we're still not even near the beginning of hard. So I just have to acknowledge that feeling and that many people right now are in pain and struggling and still contending with the health crisis on top of everything else. And I just saw today that several of our, sorry to get really political really fast, but I just read this morning that several of our Republican-led states that have been reopening their states at a frantic rate have the highest spikes in COVID infections right now. And those are continuing to rise at an alarming rate that no one's really acknowledging. And I have to say that because one of those states is my home state of Arkansas. So I hope that everyone in Arkansas is safe, and please do what you can to stay in, and I wish you all well.
Thank you, Joey. I want to say that, well, Justin and I have been friends for a number of years right now, as of now, and I think it's really, I think it was really fitting that you were able to come and join us today, because we like to talk about a big mix of not just the psychic spiritual stuff and not just the humor and the energy and the connection behind it, but also the activism behind it. And one of the things that I have always admired and connected with you is the fact that for everything that you do as an explorer and an author, and an educator as well. I do consider you an educator in the best level. And if there's anything I'm missing out of all the wonderful things that you do, you let me know and you let us know, is that with every single thing we talk about, and you and I talk about work a lot, and we talk about projects a lot, and we talk about doing things, right? We talk about moving ahead and creating the best possible circumstances for any kind of process. I've noticed that with our conversations. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that always runs consistently between all of your work is that everything doesn't just have the meaning of purpose. You're not just going and exploring for explorer's sake, but that you always go in with a definite lean towards activism and correcting historical wrongs. So I would like to sort of start the show, letting everybody know that this is really I think one of the most beautiful parts of your career, and how you've really and the trajectory in which you've gone. Because first of all, we don't get a lot of explorers in this day and age. Because many people don't think there are a lot of there's much left to explore. B, we limit ourselves in many ways. But the level to which you really dive deep and then you fight for justice is just extraordinary, hands down. And the way in which you do it and in which you carry it. So I'd like to sort of start there. If you could give us, now that I've laid all that out on you, you can maybe give us a little bit of an entree into work that you're doing, work that you've done, and maybe just a little bit more color over what you'd like to talk about.
Sure. I mean, for funny enough, we both said we probably weren't going to be talking about food, but certainly for many years, I did a lot of food programming that was Bronx-based, and really at the center of it was celebrating different cultures and different people, and using food as an easy way to connect people from different cultures, different colors, different classes, and really just getting people from everywhere down at the same table to celebrate each other and to break down those barriers that were keeping people apart. And so it's funny is, obviously things can get much deeper than that, but food was always hey, why don't we all sit down and enjoy the different elements that we can make for each other. We can essentially physically break bread, and there's so many different kinds of bread,
That's right. And food is community.
And that idea of community and bringing everyone together and just breaking down the walls that I think certainly the powers that be use to divide people, because obviously the more you can divide, the easier it is to conquer. And I think that when people sit down and just realize that everyone enjoys essentially what is delicious, we can start having those conversations and bringing folks together and kind of pulling back the veil of the, colonial methods of control to keep everyone separated, everyone suspicious, everyone fearful of one another, and saying, oh, wait, we should all be a team, because then we can essentially overthrow these evil powers that be who are brainwashing us on an individual basis to say, oh, don't go to that neighborhood, don't go to that establishment because you're not wanted there. So that was one thing, is once people started sitting down and saying, oh, wait, this is great, let's have a talk. And that kind of stemmed into our annual game dinner, which, you've been to. And as much as it is about indigenous and traditional protein sources and getting plants from the wild, it's also just about getting, once again, all these different folks from different mindsets, from, hunters from way out in New Jersey and upstate New York, being with folks like Grandmaster Melly Mel, and them all sitting down at the same table. And these groups of hunters who were all they knew about the Bronx was it was a place that they should avoid as much as they can. They've got to go through in the cross Bronx when trying to get somewhere else, but to actually be there in the Bronx at a place like the Andrew Friedman home, sitting down and surrounded by all these different cultures, has really firsthand, I've seen, these are old school John Wayne style mountain men completely change their mindset of who they thought these individuals were. So, it's through these kind of things of bringing people together and then realizing that all these different groups of people have knowledge that is worth sharing. And it isn't just being around your familiar space and the people who you've been brainwashed to believe are similar to you, and they might not necessarily be the case. It's around being around all these different folks. I'm like, wait, this is the energy that I feel. This is, like I said, you've got Melly Mel, who's a warrior, and you've got Bill the Hunter, who's a warrior, and they're sitting down together and they're breaking bread and they're feeling this mutual energy that they have, So it's one of my greatest joys is just bringing people from all walks of life together at the same table and breaking down those barriers, these invisible barriers that you're brainwashed to think, oh, I can't go do this, or I can't sit down here. And all of a sudden, the bullshit gets pushed away. And with that, as we said, kind of the bigger activism things began, where we were able to track down the skull of Nat Turner, which was a relic and Nat Turner, the great enslaved rebellion leader, that his skull had been missing since 1831. And we tracked it to Gary, Indiana, and was able to return it to the descendants of the family. And I had a conversation with the descendants yesterday, and we're hoping to have the remains entombed by the end of this year, by the end of 2020, and finally bring closure to the family, the descendants, but also hopefully some closure to the spirit of Nat Turner. And like I said, from there, all these other things have grown, and we began the History, Arts, and Science Action Network, myself and Professor Kelly Dietz, who's an archaeologist who does a lot of historic justice work. And her and I are very excited. We have another great partner, Antoinette Harrell, who is a woman who's been doing all this work with throughout Mississippi, this genealogy work throughout Mississippi and Louisiana of these lost narratives for her, not only her ancestors, but also all people of color throughout the American South, whose stories have been just really hidden within public records. And so we're getting a really strong team together to not only tell stories, but hopefully open up some of the doors, the things that have been shuttered away and hidden, so that they can be, released and essentially given a chance to come out and move forward in a more positive way.
Amazing.
Yeah, that's great. Sorry, Heather, I want to interrupt real quick. For anybody who wants to know more about Justin's work with finding and returning the skull of Nat Turner, there's a beautiful story that you wrote, because among your many hyphenates, we've neglected to include journalist. Beautifully written, beautifully put together story that is available on his website, which I have put into the chat for those of you who are interested.
Also, I just want to mention that Kelly Dietz is actually here watching. So
she's fantastic, yeah.
She's here with us now. So I just wanted to say hello and acknowledge you. Okay, so one thing I wanted to ask you, which actually I don't even know if I've ever asked you this on a personal note during our conversations, but how do you pick the that you sort of decide to do? Because I know that they're vast and they're fascinating. And one of the things that you and I always connect about is that wherever you travel and wherever you go, you not are only doing the work that you're doing, say for your show, which we'll bring up in a moment as well, but you always on your own hunt out the local spiritual advisor, witch, santera, any sort of, I wouldn't say umbrella of spiritual person, anybody who has any sort of connection to anything energetic and spiritual. So I'd like to sort of talk a little bit about that, because really my feeling is always like, if you do this work and you have an understanding of it and you are not including activism and sort of accommodating everybody on the earth, you're not doing that work. So I'd like to sort of talk to you, because I think you probably have a very interesting viewpoint of the link between the two, especially now. Because one of the things I always find is that it's so much more enmeshed in basically every culture than the white American culture, right? That is one thing that we, and then what do we do as white Americans? Take from every other culture, right? When it comes to the thinking of our own spirituality, which is something that I've always been hypersensitive about. It makes me uncomfortable. And the fact is that we all have our own culture. There's no need to go to everybody else's. You can pay homage and respect. So I just want to talk to you a little bit about that link between the spiritual and the activism, and sort of what you uncover along the way as an explorer.
Sure. Well, certainly what's at the heart of even what we're doing with the nonprofit too is celebrating these traditions that have been suppressed, celebrating these traditions that have been, there's been almost every attempt to erase them from the past and hence to the future. Even if you look at so many Indigenous Americans who weren't allowed to perform their ceremonies, their dances, their rituals for, really hundreds of years, that certain things were not even allowed to be done that had been done for thousands of years. Because here comes the entry, the colonial oppressors who are saying, oh no, you can't do that. You've got to do this thing that we brought with us. And we're going to take your sacred sites we're going to rename them and try to find a way to make it make sense with the narrative we're forcing upon you. So wherever I go, it's when you seek out the spiritual workers, you're always going to find, whether it's a country that's practicing mainly Christianity, Islam, when you seek out these traditional healers, they're always going to be there. And within whatever ritual, ceremony, talismanic item they're creating, you're going to see the original pre-missionary practices that are still within there. And they'll be within the parameters of the new book that they have had for the last few hundred years. But if you can see through the code of that, you'll see what was the true practices that had been there for 10,000 years. And I'd said this in a recent conversation that, I was in, for example, was in Uganda, and we were doing a whole thing about the funerary bark cloth. And of course, the folks who I was speaking with were largely Christian. And so I went to the market where all the witches were, had a lot of different beads made from banana seeds, these large wild banana seeds and the cowrie shells. And so, of course, I was given some of these and I was wearing them. And someone who I was talking to said, "Why are you wearing the witch beads? Are you evil? Are you a devil? Are you this? Are you that?" I said, "Well, this is paying homage to the true culture of the Baganda people. Well, I'm Baganda, but I believe in Jesus. I believe in Jesus." And I said, "Well, you understand that this is from before your family, your ancestors were taught that practice or whatever that belief was. So of course, whatever spiritual practice someone wants to engage in, but you can see that there's been a demonization of the traditional ancient ways. This is not an evil way. This is just an older way. And there's this idea that everything from before that's still lurking is really on the outskirts, and it's considered very, it's funny, it sounds, it's considered very scary, very evil, very dark. And a lot of these things will only be picked up during times of desperation, when you're praying to the larger, one of the big three religions, and you're not getting the results you want, then it's like, okay, we've got to take it all the way back. And all I could notice that, I was like, well, what makes these beads evil? What makes this bark cloth very heavy? And it's essentially that it is pre-colonialism. So that's what gives them these powers. It is just this ancient power. And to me, it's about bringing that ancient power back to the forefront and saying, this is, if we're looking at this historic timeline, this is the truth of this land. This is where all the ancestral power is. And that the other things, while they could be very positive, certainly are much newer. So don't discredit your own ancient self because of, largely the great marketing of the powers that be, or marketing or colonial oppression, whichever was the case.
Right. Well, yeah, when you walk into some place and you tell them our way is the only way, and by the way, if you don't believe that, I'll kill you,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
then it's an act of survival on the parts of the natives.
Mm-hmm.
It's the assholes that I come from. It's my lineage, unfortunately for me, that barged in those places and told everyone it's my way or the highway.
Sure, of course.
That's the part that's so hard for me.
Yeah.
But I think it's so great, one that we're even able to have this discussion, and two, that that awareness is there, and because for many it isn't, Justin, as you were talking, it was bringing me back to how I was raised, and it was very interesting because I am Colombian born, but I was raised in a white Jewish family. I was adopted. And even though my family, they had the best intention of, raising me and all of that stuff, and, connecting the cultures, the words and the things that they would say about my people was, because they didn't know, because I would want to be interested in certain things, and they would say to me, "No, that's from savages. Like, you can't do that." And I'm like, wait a minute, what are you talking about? But it's just this thing that they're unfamiliar, and it's been so delved, like deep, in so many different ways. And how have you found, that works for you to be able to continue to weave and kind of peel back some of these layers. I mean, you said some of the things that you're doing, like as far as bringing people to eat together and other ways. Like, is there any other particular like ways that you have found to have these you know, layers be peeled back in ways that can be understanding for people, because it can be really like very scary for a lot of people because they're so fearful of what they don't know that they don't know.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you. It's really just like I said, if I'm writing an article to really celebrate the ancient, and just certainly I'm always want to be involved and smell the smells and taste the taste, but also kind of observing the historic combined with the archaeological, combined with, you know, all these different layers of history, and then really just expressing the true joy that I witness and experience through some of these practices, and demystify it to the larger powers that be. You know, I go to a lot of Haitian voodoo ceremonies hosted by my friend Mambo Rose Carlene in East New York and Brooklyn and Jamaica, Queens, and telling people and just showing people pictures and short videos. And so for those who are on the outside are like, oh, you're going to a voodoo ritual tonight? It just acting as if I'm going to be, you know, hit with zombie powder and you know, something just terrible. The devils are going to come into my home when in the middle of the night, and just explaining to those who are not as aware or who have been taught to have a prejudice against these other spiritual practices, and just really be patient and explain to people that even as an outsider, how I'm welcomed in, and the love and the joy that I'm watching when, you know, one of my first ceremonies I went to, and I remember I was so excited to be there. I'm just watching, and I see this woman who had to be in her late 80s, and then there was a child who had to be 7, and they were both kind of came under the spirit, and they're both dancing as if they were the same age. And you're just witnessing this connection of the old and the young and the beauty and the joy of this. And that's not something you see in most spiritual practices.
Right.
And I'm sure that, you know, powers such as Hollywood and folks always take the convenient things that happen to be, as you know, the darker side of things, and that's all that's ever put out there, that so that an entire spiritual practice can be demonized when it's only a small fraction of it. Just as we see groups of people, there might be things done by 1 or 2, and then of course that's the message that's going to get out, and a whole group of individuals will be demonized under one umbrella, you know.
And also, like, what I see too, which is heartbreaking for me in a way, is a lot of people of color have that same, like, you know, have that same understanding about their own culture, because that it's been so demonized that they themselves, including myself, like, it's something that I really needed to delve into, relearn, because it was something that you know, for me has been taken away, and for many of us. And I feel like right now, there's a huge flux, if you will, of people of color specifically, of reclaiming their heritage, of reclaiming these practices, of you know, understanding now that, wait, voodoo isn't like, I'm not gonna, you know, have demons in my house and all these things aren't gonna happen. Like, wait, I'm actually finding like a part of myself that I kind of already knew was there, but because I wasn't allowed and cultivated to explore it, I ignored it. And that's also a big part of what's coming up too, is a lot of young, like a lot of younger people of color coming to me and saying, well, I kind of saw things when I was little, and then my grandma told me that was the devil, and then I just shut down. And so I feel like the more and more that we all embrace it, not just as people of color, not just non-people of color, of all of us, that it will bring a really amazing healing to the world, really.
Yeah, I would have to say that the number of people that I do readings for, I would say majority of them always say, I had something when I was little. and then I was not allowed to do it, or I was shamed. And inevitably it will always come up, and it will always come out, or it will bring up something that we have to connect with, even more traumatic. And I think what is really what we see about that is, and by the way, this also, we talk about this in many ways, but majority of the people who are so, I want to say, blocked in this area, and we rarely talk about spirituality and men. Right, Graciela? It's rarely spoken about in our arena. Is that we have this sort of idea of things that have to be like this in order for it to be, and instead of flow. And I think that's something else we have to sort of talk about, because we see people who have much more understanding of the spiritual or open to it, the people who are repressed. It almost always, right? Because you can kind of get by in the world we have now, and the culture that we have worldwide. The people who are in power are not spiritual people. But we cultivate, in order to survive, our intuition, those of us who are not in power, right? So, and we see this consistently. I believe people who come to me who are blocked, the majority of it, and it also told me something about how I have to learn how to be accepting and open to all people, is that for me, it was always like, I have this run of, and Graciela, you can back me on this either way, but this run of men who have always gotten by in our world, right? Who are not open to all things. And they find themselves at a place where they suddenly like, something's wrong. And what I find extraordinary is that they're coming to people like me and Graciela, because it's like, well, that's extraordinary. What made you think that you needed to come to people like us, when in fact, the whole system is rigged, especially as you were saying, Christian-based beliefs and ideologies, when that's sort of the arena that supports the world that we live in, that is very closed off.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
You know,
that resonates with me a lot. I mean, I try to live every day in service of others, and not in service of ego. And I'm grateful every day for growing up in the environment that I did as a young Gaelic who was very confused and always barred from all the traditional male rituals before I even understood why. Couldn't figure out how they clocked me. My walk might have been a good one for me to figure out. But I didn't know that then. And those, generally speaking, those people who were barring me are in service of their egos. And that, for me, has been the key to pretty much every problem that I have ever run up against. Are the people who are in service of their ego instead of being of service to others. And it's one of the things that I admire very much about you, Justin. And I wanted to loop back to one of the multi-pronged questions that Heather asked earlier, which is, what leads you into each adventure? You've done a lot of different things, and just looking at what you have cataloged on your website, there's such variety there. So I'm wondering, what leads you from one thing to another? How do you get from going in and trying to figure out why these young albino children are being killed, to uncovering Nat Turner's skull? Can you just talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, certainly the information it's usually a footnote somewhere else, or one sentence in a larger article or academic journal that'll just be like, oh, what is that? What does that term mean? And then of course it's the rabbit hole you get pulled down, and then you realize certainly you've been pulled down there for a reason. And so I try to leave myself open to being pulled further and further along. And certainly, I'm not one to believe that all these things are happening for a purpose, but certainly leaving myself open to certain things happening that are works that I should be doing. And it becomes an obsession and a passion, something that I'm just lying awake in bed at night thinking about a particular thing and just mulling it about in my head and getting more and more pieces and reaching out to different people. And it's almost like, you know, like a Rubik's Cube puzzle, you're trying these different, even thought processes or trying to work with different folks on something. And then suddenly, you know, it might be something I haven't thought about for 3 years, it clicks, and then you got to be off to the races. When that, whatever those clues are, or that connection, or somebody says, oh, by the way, you know, my friend is now the cultural minister for Iraq. And I'm like, well, I've been trying to get to Iraq to do to document the ethno-religious minorities there for 4 years. Go. It's got to be, you got to be ready to go. And so even though some of the stories I've been pursuing, they get kind of put on the back burner, or they get suppressed by a job that I have to do, you know, that's important to keep, you know, keep your home and such. It's always there. And then you never know when it's going to click. And like I said, it might be, I've been working for several years to try and get the skull of what we believe is the skull of Geronimo that was taken by Prescott Bush and four other members of the Skull and Bones Secret Society at Yale in 1918 from a grave site in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and taken to the Tombs, which is basically the clubhouse for Skull and Bones at Yale University in New Haven. And just a few days ago, and I'd written to the Bushes, I'd written to all these different folks to say, hey, I know there is a relic that you are identifying as Geronimo. And one thing I will say is that after the Nat Turner Project went public, members, descendants of Geronimo reached out to me and said, hey, can you help us out? Can you help us get our ancestors' skull back? And I said, absolutely, 100%. And I think one reason that things like this will come to me, and because no matter what, I will do everything in my power, forget safety, forget my body, whatever that is, to do the right thing. In these cases, I'm willing to lose everything when the time is right to do it. You know what I mean? And I think that might be the energies that are recognizing that and saying, hey, you know, this is someone for the job. But it's certainly, I'm not going to sit behind my keyboard and just try and do work here. When the time comes and it's like, okay, there's the window, whatever I have to do physically, mentally, no matter what the cost, I'm going to do it to make things right. And that's because that's it. That's why I'm here. That's more important than anything. Whatever that thing is at that time, it's when it's go time, it's go time. And like I said, something might be quiet for 3 years and it opens up, and that's when, you know.
Yeah, I do know. I'm the editor of a magazine, and it happens to me all the time. Someone will email me with something that says, you know, have you ever thought about doing blah, blah, blah? And I'll think, well, actually, we either have or we haven't. And it gets sort of, you know, put on the shelf. And usually what happens is that as soon as I get one little article on the shelf, several other things that tie right into that seem to sort of come right in behind it. Yeah. And it ends up, you know, creating whatever it needs to be, whether it's an article or whether it's an entire issue. Yeah, I totally get that. So what does your Rubik's Cube look like right now? What are you turning around?
There's a really big project we're doing with Hassan, which we will be talking about publicly very soon. It's massive, and it's just something we're actually gonna be physically doing it as we go public with it, just because it's very sensitive, and to go public with it before the physical action is taking place could make it close. But that will be announced. We're, you know, obviously with the current situation, with people being quarantined and such, but that will be, I'm sure, announced within the next 2 months. We will make an announcement about that, and that's what we're most excited about. Antoinette Harrell is one person I should talk a bit more about. I did a story with her about folks being enslaved in the 20th century in Mississippi, and that's really her body of work, her life body of work. And she's just a fearless individual. She's been going on to plantations, breaking onto plantations for the past 20 years in the American South to find out if folks are still being held against their will, or just being held there within the the plantation structure. And so she's someone who it's been such a joy to work with her, and you can see the documentary I did with her for Vice, which is also on the website. And you just see her power. And she lost her leg, a few years ago to cancer. And so she's just marching on these places where most people, places that are happy to fly the Confederate flag, and they've got, obviously, and she's just fearless. And so it's so great to be working with someone like that. And so her, myself, and Dr. Dietz, we're going to be going as soon as we can to a place called Natchez, Mississippi, where there's a location called Devil's Punch Bowl. And so if we think about when slavery technically on paper ended at the close of the Civil War, you had a lot of these areas that were almost like camps, essentially, as populations of formerly enslaved individuals were going northward and leaving these plantations. There was these camps to kind of give you food or shelter. And some of them were doing what, like the one in Arkansas, certain ones were doing what they were meant to do, but then others were not operating properly. And the one in Natchez, Mississippi, unfortunately, as record shows, a lot of individuals were put back into work and weren't really allowed to leave this camp. And so there is a site there called Devil's Punch Bowl where it is believed could be one of the largest mass graves on American soil that has yet to be really excavated and seen what it contains. So that's a location we're going to be going to. And one thing that Antoinette is so fabulous at is really tracking down these records, because I have a feeling there's certainly documentation of exactly what took place there. There's probably, even with our show on Explain Unexplored, there's letters. There's always letters going back from whoever it was at the time, whether it's General Grant or that really shed light on this situation. So we're going to be putting together that puzzle to really try and figure out exactly what happened at the camp in Natchez, Mississippi, and do some get permission to do ground penetrating radar and LIDAR on this whole area that is called Devil's Punch Bowl, where it is believed that thousands of folks were essentially entombed in a mass grave as they perished under these terrible conditions.
Yeah, it's interesting. I haven't heard that story in a long time, but it is commonly told in Mississippi. Usually by the people who look like me, usually by the people who look like me and speak of it with some glee in their voice. I actually had the unfortunate experience, fortunate and unfortunate, of living in Mississippi for 9 months. So I am familiar with that story, but it was never anything that I could read about. It was always something that was just sort of talked about amongst others. Sorry to dump on Mississippi. I do have some lovely people who I admire and love very much there, but yeah, it's a terribly troubled state.
Yeah.
I think one of the interesting things you mentioned real briefly is when you said on paper. Yeah. And I think we have to really remember that, especially now. When laws are changed, it doesn't mean that people go with it. When ideologies are sort of set into law, it doesn't mean people suddenly take it on. And that really, even when we start anything, whether it be a business or relationship or a country, the foundation to which it begins is everything for the rest of it, right? That's where energy starts. It's when we create something, whatever that foundation is taken with it. And we have to remember this country, and most countries, actually, most newly established countries never start because everybody was happy to see each other in the first place. And I think we have to really remember that there is an enormous amount of healing that goes on, and how do we handle it? Because there are still people there is something in a DNA of anything that starts that we are always working towards and against, depending on how we want to sort of we make these decisions for ourselves. Like you were saying, I know that I will put myself in whatever harm's way to do the right thing. And I think we have to remember that we walked into a country that really did not start, with the right thing. And this is what it takes to begin to sort of even undo it. And do we know if we can ever undo it completely? I don't know that myself. But we have to. We have to at least begin to sort of like flesh it out.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the most interesting things about that is that when you and I have these conversations, it always ends up with the energetic and the spiritual.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. I always think that's one of the most brilliant things about the work that you do.
Well, thank you. It's all, you know, because it's all being fed over and over and over, generation upon generation upon, and as you're talking about a place like Mississippi, there's such conflict, even in the soil, even in the geography, you know, you feel it everywhere you go, and it's been there, and it's, you know, hasn't had time to really breathe. And that's why I think it is important we go to places like Devil's Punch Bowl, and instead of just planting more fruit trees or whatever's there right now, really scrape it back and once again, let it out. Stop burying these things and just saying, you know, it's like we went to, when we were in Southampton, Virginia, we were doing the documentary for National Geographic about Nat Turner. And there's this, what we believe is a slave cemetery that's just next to like a pharmacy. And, you know, Dr. Dietz was doing ground penetrating radar in the area. And there's like all these things are here, and it's just, as you're saying, as with Devil's Punch Bowl, just locally, it's hearsay. And people are like, oh yeah, I think right there, there was a kind of like a cemetery, and there's no markings, there's no honor, there's no plaque, there's nothing to it. And when we were filming Southampton, you know, we had a film crew, and folks would pull up and be like, hey, what you doing? And say, we're doing a documentary about Nat Turner. And you could see they just were very upset by it, and they kind of peel out and take off, you know. And that's what we're doing. We're here to tell the story of what was here, you know. And of course they know, you know, they've been there for generation upon generations, but it's these things that folks don't want to face within the history, and let this, you know, just wants to be kind of forgotten. But it doesn't really address the situation, and it can't let the healing of these larger traumas begin to heal if you're not addressing it directly. You know?
Well, you know, as we say, truth heals, right? And we have to really dig up for the truth. You know, in what reference to what you were saying, I noticed, like, I'm in upstate New York right now, right? And I've been coming up to this one place, this one house, my entire life. And there are areas just north of here that even when I drive through it, ever since I was little, I get nauseous, I get sick, I don't feel well. And, you know, when you're dealing with any land in America, it didn't occur until I was more in touch with everything going on with myself. You were always in touch with the fact that, like, where there is energy like that, there were always atrocities, you know. And in fact, there's only activism because there are atrocities. If there were no such thing, we would not have to have it, right? Well, I don't know how many times you and I've had a conversation about, you're like, I'm working on this one project, and I'm like, I'm going.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was like, we're going to go look at this. I'm like, I got to go to that. Are we going to move anybody's soul to the other side? You know me, I want to be there.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, but I just really want to sort of talk a little bit about how, because you said to me yesterday, I made a joke about something you said. I was like, I was about to write you, and I made a joke as like, what are you, psychic? And you're like, well, I really don't think I am. But, you know, the fact is that you are always so sensitive to the areas that you must go. You know, it's not just like you're going, oh, that sounds great, but there's a reason why it sounds great to you.
Right.
You know, and like we all have, there's this great woman named Naomi Rachel Remen, and she was a surgeon, and she realized at one point when she was working on somebody that you could feel the energy coming up out of somebody, and she's like, oh God, there's more to this. And she ended up becoming more of somebody who writes about the spiritual aspect of any sort of surgery, of hands-on medical work, right? And she looked at history and how we deal with the human body. And where was I going with this? I was getting so excited. I forgot where I was going with this completely. Oh well.
Well, you were talking about how the psychic impulse is in all of us, and how it can lead us and how it can lead us into different areas. And I think that that's true. And you know, coming just looping back to your previous comment about maleness, and not to just shit all over men today.
Oh, no, not at
Please
all.
do.
As I am
Please
so
do.
want to do.
Oh, not at all. But I mean, like, but we're really, what I was saying with that one is when when people go for the power, they cut themselves off in this world, right?
Yeah.
Of that. Like, think about all the things that we do not allow our boys and our men to experience in that, because we're like, well, if you're going to go into spirituality, you must become a priest, or you must become this, and you must become that. So that's really what I was talking about. How what is bad for one of us is bad for all of us. If we have too much of one thing, we don't have each other. That's what I was going with that. So thank you about that. I didn't want to shit all over anybody.
Yeah, no. Well, I do sometimes, but that's a side note. Yeah, because truthfully, you know, the main rule that I grew up with was men should always live in fear. You're always living in fear of something, of being too feminine, of being too sensitive, of being too cerebral, or too thoughtful, or too, you name it. And there's all these layers. It's the sediment same sediment under which all those people are buried in Natchez. You know, it's that same thing. You live in fear, and that's how you get controlled.
That's right.
Be more like this, because that's the ideal we're shooting for, right?
Yeah, right.
And I also wanted to say that, to spiral back about the spirituality piece, because Justin, when you were just speaking of your process and being led, I mean, definitely, not only are the ancestors guiding you, but I feel like you are just so in tune, because you're like, okay, it sounds like you are releasing that fear, and you're just surrendering to what you're hearing, and then you're being guided. You know, does it for you, do you feel like it's a spiritual process that you go through in any way, like to get guided? And also, when you're at these sites, is there any spiritual ritual or practice that you all do to honor, you know, the communities, the people, you know, culture of the people that you are working with?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, everywhere we go, whatever it is we're doing, there's always offerings made to not only the land, but the people who would have been of that land, and just to take the time to ask permission and let my intention be known to whatever energies are there. And I'm not sure what they are, and I don't believe there's an exact scientific, because at the end of the day, very much I am operate in the world of science, and so I don't pretend to know what is the true answer, but certainly open myself up and ask for support to do what is the right thing to do, and always will tell either the land or the ancestral spiritual land that I know I'm here for the right reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Please just don't block me from doing what should be done. And even as simple as last night, we gave a talk about a swim I did around Islay, Scotland, and we went to the Corryvreckan, which is this giant whirlpool, and we essentially were talking to just asking permission of the island and the ancient Celtic spirits that would have been there, and paying homage to that, and pouring whiskey into the eye of the whirlpool, and and burning the peat, whatever it was. I think to the best of my ability, whatever the offerings that would be appropriate are the ones that are offered, and certainly that is something that is important. And just taking the moment and not going in there, crashing into this place, just approaching slowly and carefully, whatever it is, and treating whatever may have happened there with the utmost respect, and also being open, because I certainly, with my own eyes, have never seen anything, as what might be described as an apparition or a physical vision or something that I couldn't explain scientifically. I've certainly felt very strong feelings, but nothing where it's like, okay, well, that's purely a spirit from another time that I'm seeing within the same space I'm at. I'm completely open to seeing that, would love to, but it's more of as I think you guys were suggesting, more of an instinct that I just let kind of happen, whatever it is, to further guide me down the path. And as you know, life gets in the way. You could be really in tune with something, and then it's like, oh, shit, my transmission just went, you know, I gotta go get the transmission on the car fixed,
Well,
or whatever it is.
that's
and
the
get-
ancestors too sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. But to me, there, like I said, there's never any sense of fear. And certainly you get that from folks who have been taught to be afraid. Aren't you worried about these things you're bringing, and you're bringing them into your home, or this or that? And it's, my intention is always a positive one. It's always one for a bigger picture that really has very little to do with myself. And so it's like, I have no fear being in any location about energies and such, because it's just going in there with this good feeling, and just an ear, you know, and just listening to what am I supposed to take from this? What am I supposed to do? And that's really the only question is, whatever place I'm at, whoever I'm trying to communicate with, I'm just saying, let me know what you want me to do.
Yeah.
And I'll, you know,
Yeah.
what am I supposed to take from this? What is the story that needs to be told that hasn't been told, you know?
Being of service.
Yeah.
Being of service. It's
Yeah.
so beautiful. Yeah. Not to get all Brene Brown on your ass, but to get all Brene Brown on your ass, you know, she always says that the key to, that the most courageous people are the people who are the most vulnerable. And the people who are comfortable or challenge themselves to be vulnerable. And I would say that that's definitely a place, whether you do it consciously or not, Justin, it's a place where you seem to operate from.
Oh, thank you.
That seems to fuel your courage, and I admire that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I would just want to say that considering the work that you do and how you want to get it out there as public as possible, you are extremely quiet about your work. You know what I mean? Like it's never for show's sake, ever. Even if to say like you've been on television and you've had opportunity and you're connected with this sort of great, you know, media outlets and stuff, when you talk about your work, you are extremely quiet about your work. It's like, it's almost like when I talk to you, sometimes it feels like, well, you're like, it hasn't really passed, it hasn't like cut the mustard yet for me. So I'm not letting it out. It just, it is what it is. And then you find out that you have like 40 different projects or things to support on hand, and you would never, ever know it by the way that you do your work.
Interesting.
It's all for the purpose is how it comes across.
Yeah. Cool. One interesting story I just want to share with you guys, that it just was kind of an unusual situation. I'll see if I have the artifact somewhere right around, it's within 10 feet of me. But when we were filming in Ethiopia, you know, it's one of the most religious and spiritual places I'd ever been. You know, of course, with the Orthodox practice, it was very beautiful and just, but it's everywhere. There was actually almost like spiritual toll booths where you had priests or debturas who were on the side of the road who would be waiting for you to stop by and get a blessing. And if whenever a debtura or priest would come into a place where you'd be having a drink, you'd offer them a drink and they'd give you a blessing. And it was just everywhere, so rich and deep within it. But obviously we have these spiritual workers known as debteras, and they're of the church, but they're also outside the church. So once again, I was trying to find a true debtera to see what these practices were. And they make something called a kitab, which is this small sheet of paper. And on it, they basically write a contract in the ancient language, pre-Aramaic, called jez. And that is the true language. And that is the language with any rituals or ceremonies, is the language that must be spoken for it to activate. So we were in the Tigray region, and we were in a very remote area, and some local friends took us to meet this debtera. And anytime I've met with who was one of the top spiritual workers of a location, you're on a road, the road gets very bumpy, and then essentially the road ends. And then you start walking. And this has happened, especially obviously in other countries where it isn't so, you know, cookie cutter, but you know, the road ends and then you're walking down a muddy path and then you come to this beautiful place. And this has happened multiple times in my life when I've been going on these journeys. And we met this debtera, and we're in his house, and he starts to make this kitab with his grandson. And there's some other his other grandchildren were in this small dark house with us. We're all sitting kind of on little benches, and we're right under this very large mountain. And I saw, so he's writing this thing. So used in older times, it would have been written on a piece of goat skin in blood. But now he's writing it on a small piece of paper with red ink. And then he has this all written together. And then I put my name in 2 spots and basically saying that I'd be protected. And one of the things you're being protected from is something called a Buddha, which is almost like a bad sorcerer or sorceress who can transform into a hyena. So these are just some of the traditional fears that would have been something that this would protect you from. Folds it up very small and then puts it inside a little piece of leather and hammers it shut, and then you carry that with you. And during that process, one unusual thing that happened was there was a young, probably like a 4 or 5-year-old child leaning against a pillar, which was one of the grandchildren, and he's smiling and just doing his thing, and then all of a sudden he gets very serious. He's just staring at me, and he stared at me for over a minute, an unbreakable gaze, and I'm just looking at him smiling, and he completely transformed, and he was just staring directly at me. And then within a minute he was back to normal, and he's looking around again with a big smile on his face, at which point the Debtera stared at me. And it was this, whatever was, and it's only my observation, it could have just been, hey, the kid was just checking me out, but I saw a clear change and it was almost as if this spirit moved into the child and then into the Debtera, and the Debtera just looked at me and twisted his head, and it was almost an identical gaze that the child had, and he just had unbreakable, for no reason. It wasn't, he just stopped what he was doing and looked at me and was just kind of studying me. And then after, I'm like, okay, he's clearly feeling, or whatever it was, the same thing the child had. And then just as with the child, it stopped and he went back to making the talisman. And it was just a very interesting moment, which, I really enjoyed, and it was just because it was something so different and really, in some ways, delightfully startling, because it was like, something's happening here. Something very real is happening here. And we were having the transaction we were going to have regardless. It wasn't, I was like, oh, let me do further service. It's like, we're here, we're meeting you, would love to have you make this kitab for me, and one for my friend Emiliano. And so then we had a great lunch afterwards. So it wasn't being done to impress us or intimidate us at all. It was just seemed like a very real moment spiritually.
Yeah, it's interesting that that you described it as a contract, that you had to actually fill your name in a couple of spots. I find that so interesting. Sorry to loop back to Brene Brown again, but she writes herself permission slips when she feels really uncomfortable about doing something. She makes herself a permission slip, like a mother would give to a child. My child has permission to go on this trip, and she puts things that are permission for herself. So there's great power in those little notes.
Yeah.
No matter what culture you come from. Speaking of rituals and blessings, I'm wondering, Graciela, since we're right at time, if you would give us a blessing to take us out today.
Yes, definitely. If we could all just take a deep, unified inhale breath. And just gently exhale. Know that many of us are feeling not able or not being able to really feel grounded and connected in everything that is going on in the world today. Spiritually, physically, and I send in prayers to each and every one of us that through all this tumultuous time, that we continue to stay grounded and fortified in our love for each other, in our love and trust for humanity, that we have this trust that the majority of us are able to make the right choices, and that the majority of us are here to serve and do the right thing. And the more that we are able to go inside ourselves with love, compassion, integrity, and dignity, we will then be able to find our own inner truth, what that means to you, to be able to heal yourself physically, mentally. And if that means that we need just a moment just to take a deep breath, if that means that we need to back away from the media, whatever that means for you, give yourself, write yourself that permission slip for what you need. And I pray that we each will be able to continue to be brave enough to have enough love to give for ourselves so that we will be able to continue to serve. And if we aren't able at this moment, knowing that it is okay, and knowing that we are here for each other, and we are getting through this together. And where you are right now, we are all here with you. And we love you, and we're sending that love to each and every one of you in this moment, knowing that with community in numbers, we are more powerful. So continue to stay connected as much as you can when you're able to, knowing that we will get through this together. Sending you so much love and peace and harmony.
Thank you, Graciela.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Justin, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Justin.
Thank
I enjoyed
you.
it.
I love you all. We'll see you next week.
Okay,
Great.
thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for joining us online.
This will be up on our YouTube channel by the end of the weekend.
Great.
Okay, thank you.
Take care.
Be well.